It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by Agile Dad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started. All right, it's confession time for me. When I first saw the name of this article that someone requested that I review, I thought I was going to be in for regret and disappointment. The name of the article is How Deep is Your Product Backlog? Now, it's by a young lady named, I hope I don't butcher this, Teodora Todrova. And Teodora says, how deep is your product backlog? And I'm like, oh boy. She says, when I coach the team to help raise its productivity, I always start with the audit of the product backlog. Why? Because everything starts with requirements, and product backlog contains all of them. So she goes on to explain how she assesses a team's product backlog. Now, when I first read the title, I thought this was going to be, you should have no more than 220 items, or you should have no more than, N plus three, or whatever it was going to be. But I was shockingly surprised. Theodore did an excellent job on this article based on what I've read so far. And she talks about things that help the team become more predictable. So, the number one tip to become more predictable is to maintain your product backlog appropriately. So, the product backlog is the most important thing you have to maintain in order to have a smooth process and be predictable for your deliveries. 100% agree. When I coach team to help raise its productivity and open its eyes to the mistakes in the way that they're working, I always start with an audit of the product backlog because this is the primary tool for planning. Not by accident, it is the artifact at the start of the Scrum diagram. Everything in a project starts with a list of requirements. In Agile projects, this list is the product backlog and it contains all the work that needs to be done and is known at this time. Okay, let's stop there. So, one of the things that's interesting is I recently did an advanced class. It was actually a level 3 class. And we're talking about known knowns and unknown knowns and known unknowns and known knowns. I know that sounds crazy. But sometimes there are things that are in the backlog that don't necessarily need to be there. And other times there are things that aren't in the backlog that should be there. Sometimes we do it based on availability of individuals or teams. Other times we do it based on how the backlog is organized time wise and how we appropriately believe that certain things can be done within a certain bandwidth, N plus two, whatever the case may be. But one of the things I discovered is that the best way to maintain a backlog is to say, these are the things that we know we are going to get to. And instead of having all the work that could ever possibly want to be done and overloading a backlog, maintaining an appropriate size backlog is also important. So oftentimes you hear me say you should have a product backlog and then a product owner backlog that contains all the ideas, permeations, things that you may or may not ever get to. That way you don't lose good ideas, but at the same time, that way you can have a list of things that you can go back to later if you need to. So when she asked the question, how deep is the backlog? I grew concerned that it was going to be a formula of some kind. But then she went on to use deep in all caps. And that's when I realized that, it's an acronym because acronyms help us remember things easily. So deep, when it comes to a product backlog, means 4 different things. So here they are. The first, the D, is detailed appropriately. The E is estimated properly. The next E is emergent. And the last is P for prioritized. And we're going to talk about this. So let's talk about detailed appropriately. This means that you have the right level of detail for each of the items in the backlog. Now, consider it like a funnel. The things that are coming up soonest, they're going to be the smallest and are going to have the greatest amount of detail. The things that are far out may not have as much detail, right? So if you're going to pull an item into your next sprint, you probably want to make sure you have enough information so that there's not unknowns. And she uses, in her example, priority, high priority versus low priority items. Now, we all know how I feel about priority. As long as you're using priority to illustrate urgency and not using priority to mean importance, I'm okay with that. Because in her world, high priority means small, well-defined items that will be done within the next couple of sprints. I can live with that. Low priority means bigger, not well-defined items that still need much refinement before the team starts working on them. Now, those items, in my opinion, probably belong in a product owner backlog and not in a product backlog, depending on the size of your organization. If you're a small organization and your product is a normal size, then sure, you can put everything in one single backlog and it works very smoothly and very effectively. If you're a very large enterprise organization and your product is huge and many, many teams work on it, you probably are going to have to maintain two separate backlogs, one for the product owner to carry all their whims, wishes, desires, thoughts, when you wake up in the night in a cold sweat, those kind of things, and then a separate backlog that the team's going to draw from and work from. So usually she says she gets to question what is the meaning of adding something to the backlog if there are so many unknowns. This simply increases transparency, which is vital for an agile environment. If it stays somewhere in the personal product owner's list, haha, ding, 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 it will not help anyone. And there's no chance of raising discussion and asking questions about the item. But in a way, I feel like that's healthy. So as long as the product owner is coached properly, and as long as the product owner understands what the product owner backlog is and how it can be leveraged, um, it's appropriate. Once again, based on the size of the organization and the size of the product. But in this case, this was a smaller organization. And she says how surprised she was when I told her that she doesn't have to describe everything that's added to the backlog in great detail. You can keep items separately in a private backlog until all details were precise. But she felt overwhelmed all the time and she couldn't manage all her time effectively since she was spending so much time on items that weren't a priority for the team right now. That is a driver for getting everything organized. So, one of the top things that I recommend when we talk about the Agile 12-step program, one of the hardest steps, step number 4, is to create and maintain a proper product backlog. And what I can tell you is it's not as easy as it sounds. There's a lot of wisdom there, but there's a lot of thought that goes behind it. There's a lot of structure that goes behind it. So you need to make sure you understand how the product backlog works. And if you want more information about how we can leverage and how the product backlog works and what it means, we can do that in a separate episode. Let's get to the E in deep. The first E. The first E is for estimated. All items in your backlog should be estimated. Now, all those who know me know once again that I hate using numbers. So she goes to the Fibonacci sequence, which is fine 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 40, 100, modified Fibonacci sequence. And she goes on to say if it's big with many unknowns, you should use the numbers on the right side of the line. If it's broken down into small enough chunks, you can use the right or the left side of the line. Which I think is great. But the problem is you still have to explain what all these numbers mean. So in my world, I use T-shirt sizes, and I just leveraged a 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8, saying that 1 is extra small, 2 is small, 3 is medium, 5 is large, 8 is extra large. And I don't necessarily stick with the 13 is 4 times bigger than a 3 mentality, because there's really no way for a team to get their head around that mentality unless they start thinking in terms of time. And one of my biggest goals for Teodora and for all of you is to get teams to separate story points from time. So if you're going to do that, the best way that I found to do that is to use the T-shirt sizes and then tie them back to story points. And I don't care if you actually use T-shirt sizes or dog sizes or dinosaur sizes. I don't care what you use as long as you use something that's not a number. All right, let's get to that next E. The next E is emergent. Now, you and your team already operate in an agile environment. You know that change is inevitable, and your product backlog should reflect the changes. But sometimes teams are afraid to change the backlog because it will affect the plan long term too. And it may make them in a situation where they can't meet a deadline. It doesn't change the fact that change is there and it needs to be handled. So sometimes it's easier to just handle something uh, as it comes in. So this is how does your team handle interruptions? Do you have a system in place to handle external things that happen or changes to the backlog? And I put together a nice program called Team John to help with this, so that if you have an organization where teams are sized appropriately and you don't have a ton of technical debt, you can implement this system and it will help you manage all of these inbound interruptions so that you can be aware of things that are emergent and so that you can take care of those things as they happen. Um, this doesn't mean that there won't ever be an emergency. This doesn't ever mean that there won't be critical issues that come up that need to be addressed immediately. It's just a matter of figuring out how you're going to categorize or classify things and whether it's a category one, two, or three, and what are you going to do in each of those categories, and setting up a working agreement in place that talks about how you're going to handle each of these things. I think that combination is probably the most appropriate. So know how to handle inbound work. And then finally, P is prioritized. And when I talk about prioritized, this is rank order. Now, in my classes, and especially in my advanced classes, I teach the concept of objective stack ranking, which allows you to use a system with priority, which equals urgency, Moscow, which is the consumer's desire, and then finally the t-shirt size or dinosaur size or whatever you're using, and triangulate those to come up with a stack rank order that's completely objective. And then from there, you can tweak it to get to where you need to do. So sometimes if you don't have that system in place, you end up with fake priority orders or people who are constantly jockeying for their things to be put near the top, or you end up with Hippo, where the highest paid person's opinion is the most important. So it's important for us to get our head around how we can do these things. And I realize this was a longer episode, but this topic was pretty deep. So one more time on deep, just to make sure you got it: detailed appropriately, estimated, emergent, and prioritized. And that's a deep product backlog. So Teodora, great job. You did well on your post. If you have a topic you want us to cover or something you'd like for us to review, much like this, please send us a note over to learnmore@agiledad.com, where we'd love to hear from you and love to cover your topic. And as always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.